And welcome back to Tales of Abundance, everyone. I'm Dr. John Oberg. Joining me, as always, my co-host, Randy Lorenzen. Randy, how are you?
Doing great.
I gotta tell you, I am so excited about today. Matthew Lysiak. Okay, we just talked about this off the air. Lysiak?
You nailed it.
Lysiak, I got it right. All right, we practiced before, and I still didn't have confidence in that one. But Matthew Lysiak here today to talk about a lot more than just his book, Fiat Food. Randy, you caught Matthew speaking at a conference.
Yeah, at the Bitcoin Commons here in Austin, he was speaking at an event, talking about his book, and I was fascinated. It was the topic, and frankly, his enthusiasm and his passion for it was very, very obvious and very evident. And I just thought, this guy's a great guest. We have to get him on.
Love it. Well, Matthew, welcome. We're so glad you could have you here today.
Thank you. I'm honored. I appreciate you having me. Thank you very much.
This is fun. You know, I think in the room we have like Randy, who is, a Bitcoin fanatic might not be a deep enough statement about his enthusiasm of Bitcoin. I own Bitcoin a little bit because Randy told me to buy it when it was like, I don't know, $200, and I waited until it was a lot more than that. Wish I'd listened. And it sounds like reading your book, you're probably a Bitcoin fanatic too.
I am. I've been converted.
All right. Okay. That's like I've been converted to Catholicism. You guys have been converted to Bitcoin. So we'll see how that plays out today. I'm excited about this. I'm a huge advocate of Bitcoin and where it's headed. Not like you two are, but the link to food was a shocking one to me. We'll get there in a few minutes. I want to talk about your journalistic background. Can we start there, Andy?
Yeah, absolutely.
Journalism, man. Like I had a horrible experience with a journalist when I was in high school where I was at a sports team. We just had a big win, and this guy had been beat up in high school as a journalist. And he came to me and he asked me some questions about the infighting between our sports team and another sports team on campus. And my answer was, I have a lot of great friends on that other sports team. We support them, rabidly. But sure, there's times that people might get sideways, but we're all great friends. And the headline was, two sports teams still fighting at this high school. And then I was made a pariah at my high school. I was made to look really bad, lost a lot of friends over the thing. And I was really upset because he misconstrued. I mean, he literally took things out of context for his own agenda. And that was my first experience with media. And journalism has a up and down history. We talked a little about this before we got on. So how did you get into journalism? And I found your journalism to be really well researched, like the kind of journalism I would have hoped for when I was 17, not what I experienced.
I've always loved journalism, and I think about this a lot because I have 4 daughters, and you watch people's natural inclinations as they grow up, and I think about my own past, and I've always been into newspapers. Not so much into school, and when I was younger, in my public school, there was no journalism program. There was yearbook, and I ended up dropping out of high school. And being obsessed with journalism, I tried taking a part-time class at university in journalism, but my professor had never worked in journalism. He just had a degree in journalism. I didn't feel like I could learn anything. Started my own newspaper in my town when I was 17.
Wow.
Let's go there. Let's not just walk over that. Most 17-year-olds that don't just start their own newspaper. So tell us more about that.
I knew nobody would hire me to write a newspaper, so I was going to start my own newspaper. I started a newspaper called the Danvillian, based in Danville, Pennsylvania. Had some good stories. I exposed an illegal sabbatical. My principal and superintendent had networked together, and he had to resign, and exposed mistreatment at a local nursing home. So I was very proud of my paper, but I needed to go to New York City. I was in a small town in Pennsylvania, and I was that guy who went to New York City telling everybody I'm going to be a writer, and just kind of scrapped my way from smaller newspapers. Like my first job was at the Brooklyn paper, and then the New York Sun. I did a third shift editorial gig, and very serendipitously I ended up at the New York Daily News, which at the time was the 5th biggest paper in the country. And I became the national reporter. So my job was, for years, anytime a national story broke, have the backpack in my car, hit the next flight. A lot of mass murders, a lot of mass shootings, and I was obsessed in terms of government corruption and crime. Those were my 2 fortes in journalism.
You say those like they're different.
I mean, there's a lot of interlinkages.
I have a lot of friends in government. True. I shouldn't say it that way. I was just being cheeky.
It's well put, though, and right on. My particular fascination was motive, like why people did the things that they did. So on a mass shooting, the paper might send a few reporters to cover funerals. I was always there to cover the reason, try to put pieces together on why the shooter committed the shooting. And I've just been fascinated ever since. My career after the New York Daily News, I have 4 kids, and my wife was getting annoyed at the whole idea that I was gone half the year covering stories, and I made the transition to book writing. From there, moved out of New York City into the country. Didn't know how that would work.
By the country, you are. I mean, tell people what that means.
Well, that first meant I moved back to my hometown of Danville, Pennsylvania. My kids were thrilled about that, going from Brooklyn to this small town. And then my daughter, Hildy, who's now 18, we wanted a quieter life, and she gained a bit of notoriety because she got into journalism at a very, very young age. And it became a bit overwhelming in terms of suffocating with a small town, with her becoming like a national figure for a while. So then we moved from there to Patagonia, Arizona, which is really out in the middle of nowhere, 18 miles from the Mexican border in the middle of the high desert, tiny town, and that's where we live now.
And Hildy's got Hildy's got books on Amazon. I saw.
She sells way more books than me.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I went out and was doing a little homework and pulled that up and saw that you were the co-author.
Right. I mean, it's funny because she was so young that she wasn't able to just have her name on the book, but it was fun working with my kid.
Yeah.
It's not so fun that when your kid's the boss of the project, though.
Yeah.
It becomes a little awkward. We always had to have these editor interventions that were always a hoot.
That's fun.
Okay, from New York City, Brooklyn, to the middle of the desert in Arizona. I mean, what caused that? I mean, there's less extreme ways to get out of the city.
Yeah, that's a good point. I covered Gabby Giffords, the shooting that happened in Arizona by a young man named Jared Loeffner. And when I was there, I got in a bit of trouble because I didn't understand the shield laws in Arizona were very different than in New York. So in New York, you could get onto somebody's property to get pictures. In Arizona, you can't do that. So we actually did that, and law enforcement was very, very upset with us when we saw the paper the next day.
In Texas, you get shot for that. I mean, I don't know what the law. I'm not sure about the laws, but
it was an interesting time. But we had to flee Tucson because the shield laws were different, and they could legally detain my photographer and I. And we kind of had to ditch our phones and go to Sedona because there was a snowstorm. We couldn't get out. We couldn't get out of Arizona. But I remember being in Sedona and thinking, I want to bring my kids here one day. I want to bring my kids to see Sedona. It's a fascinating place. And when we did come here for a short vacation, while my youngest daughter was kind of blowing up in that time period, my wife was addicted. She just moved here. And as a writer, I could now it didn't matter where I lived, and it sounded about right. So we made the move to also the seclusion. I mean, my kids might not like it, but selfishly, for my wife and I, it was paradise to just not be hearing the traffic all the time.
It's great.
Yeah, I get it. We made a move, my wife and I, about a year ago. Now our kids got out of school or went to college, but we went out into the country too, and it's just better.
Yeah, and you make trade-offs in life all the time, as we were discussing previously, and I loved my career and I loved my job, and my bosses were great to me. I miss my job almost every day. I think about the New York Daily News and what it used to be in my role there. But my marriage was not where I wanted it to be. My wife was very unhappy with my absences. She would say, I didn't sign up to be a single mom. Like, what is this? And I would always say, well, okay, I'll talk to my editors, but after this next story, I'll tell them I can only do really big ones. And it just never worked out that way. So when we moved and I got my first book deal, which was with Simon & Schuster. It was called Newtown. It was about the shooting that happened in Sandy Hook by Adam Lanza. I remember just saying to her, let's go. I got this book advance. This is our opportunity. I hope people keep buying my writing, but if they don't, I'll wait tables and we'll be fine. We'll be happy. And fortunately, I haven't had to wait tables yet. But I don't regret that decision at all. I get to spend birthdays with my kids, I don't miss events. And at the end of it, right, like, family's everything.
Yeah. I don't want to take a left turn on you, Randy. Now I have questions about lifestyle of a writer. Yeah. So, I mean, I think a lot of people romanticize being a writer, right? Maybe a reporter, maybe an author. I just actually wrote a book and released it yesterday.
Oh, congrats.
Yeah, it's on some consulting work we've been doing inside the church. And I think we've sold a copy. I bought it. And Randy is working on a book. And I think there's a lot of maybe misconceptions about what it means to be a writer in the lifestyle. Like, being a journalist is hard. Being a writer is hard. Can you just give us a little compare and contrast? Like, what were the biggest surprises, good and bad, of being a journalist and then being a journalistic author of books, I guess?
As an investigative crime reporter, it was different phases for me. And one of them was I was around people's most intense moments of their lives every day.
Yeah.
So it became difficult for me when I would deal with a mom who just lost her son to a drunk driver. And I'm spending my day with her, and then I would come home to my family, and it sounds like the Charlie Brown wonk wonk voice. Like, I can't really engage emotionally to their complaints, which seem so trivial suddenly when you see bigger life pictures, but are valid nonetheless to young girls growing up and my wife. That was part of it that I think would surprise people, is just I noticed there's a similarity between EMT workers. Like, when I talk to them, they have that feeling that, like, the intensity, it becomes addictive. And then there's a narcissism that falls into it too, I think, personally, where when you're around such important events all the time, your perspective can get a little bit slanted on the bigger picture of life. I became just crave an adrenaline junkie for a long time, and it was hard to unplug from that. Now, as a writer, what I write every day, and some of the time it's awful and I feel like an idiot. I'm sitting at the computer and nothing's coming out, but the process is what is important. And it does seem glamorous, and I love my life, but I'd be lying if I said that it was always fruitful. Most of my projects fail. I write all the time, and they're not bought, or my agent doesn't like it.
So you're writing books and articles and selling them. It's a little bit like gig work.
I'm at a point now where people buy everything I write.
Okay.
So I feel very fortunate. But for most of it, my biggest skill, I think, was enduring failure and being told I sucked.
All trial and error for you? Or did you have a mentor who kind of took you and said, hey, here's the way you're successful with this?
I had really great people help me along the way. Yeah. But when I first tried to get into New York City journalism, because of my lack of education, I had a chip on my shoulder. I talk to my kids about this all the time. I always feel like they're at a disadvantage because they're told how great they are too much. I had a chip on my shoulder. I had no degree. I had no high school education. So I'm competing against all these Columbia J School kids. But what I had was I'd worked at customer service jobs like McDonald's. So I was used to dealing with other people, and that was an advantage I had. And I realized it early on was this Columbia J School kid who's had a very pampered life doesn't know how to interact with his mother who looks nothing like them and can't open the door and get that interview because they can't relate.
Yeah.
And I try to use that to my advantage. And I was a scrapper. I still consider myself a scrapper. I try really hard. I don't think I'm the brightest guy on earth, but I work very, very hard.
But we'll get to your book in detail in a bit. I will tell you that you're incredibly well-researched book. I really appreciate it. As a guy with a doctorate, I did feel a little of that with the chip on the shoulder, like against the guys with the doctorates. I was like, hey man, that's not me. Like, that might be some and I think it was well called out. Like, you were calling out that, like, just because someone has a doctorate doesn't make them credible in everything. And there's a lot of people that have that degree that try to hold it out to be more than what they studied. And I think that's important. So I agreed with that, but I felt the chip a little too.
It's there. And in particular, I take a lot of exception to a societal movement where too many people have outsourced their own decision-making to credentialism.
Yeah.
And I think that we shouldn't just shit on the credentialed people. They can have their opinions too, but to really make, like, we're all smart, people are smart, and we should not outsource our decision-making, and especially in terms of health, because we've been lied to a lot.
So interesting. I walked into medical clinics 5 years ago, no degree, and walked into medical clinics now with a degree. And when I say, "Hey, Dr. John Oberg to see so and so," it was like immediately red rug, doors open. What it was like, I have the same words, the same information, the same like that has not changed. I mean, I know more now because it's 5 years later, but fundamentally, it was going to be the same conversation. And so it was both like, I'm glad I did it, and frustrating that there's so much information coming at us. I understand why it happens. It just sucks that it happens. So much information, so much noise cutting through it. It's credentialism. I've never heard that before. I'm going to write that one down. I like that. I like that a lot.
I mean, it's becoming better now. And I think, we talked about the media landscape and the open access of information, which really began with the internet. I mean, obviously the printing press before that, but the internet gave us all this kind of information that we didn't have access to before, and podcasts like yours, which are changing the media landscape. So I know it's like people are like, oh, bro science, it's or just anecdotal evidence, but anecdotal evidence can be evidence too. If it happens to you, I mean, I am a big believer in trying things and trying different things and seeing how they work and how they react. But I do think that we should be cynical of a lot of credentialed authority, especially today. And you see a break today with that. You see a lot of people venturing in different areas. And I think that's good.
Well, there's so much information about individualism and how different we are, like scientifically, genetically. And so I think that in your book, it touched on this, but I wish it was a little stronger. It's like you had someone go in there, and we'll get into the, what to eat, how to eat. And he said, this is what I eat, and this works for me. And I think that was such a powerful, like, if I was, I was listening to the book, but if I was reading it, I'd have like highlighted, underlined it, circled it. Like in the medical practice that I work in, we tell people like what works for John may not work for this patient. And there are times where, we might have to move one direction or another. There's a broad direction towards eating healthy, but we've been told as a society, there's like this one thing. And we've been told that by a marketing engine. That we're not, and we can trace it back to when there was a kind of a schism in the world of psychology where a whole bunch of clinical psychologists went to work in marketing, in the later part of the 20th century, that really caused us to have people giving us information in ways they understood that we didn't. And that's a little unfair if you think about it, right? And that, anyway, I'm all over the place here, but let's go back to the fourth pillar of journalism and what the Founding Fathers did. And my goal is to bring us back to a point where we talk about how the Founding Fathers saw journalism, and then I want to bring it back to like where should regulation play a role versus what the policymakers are doing today, which is, I think, broadly in need of help. Is that a gentle way of saying it?
I'm a very optimistic person in terms of media right now. I don't cry over my old employer's death, the New York Daily News, as it's barely a paper anymore. There's a nostalgic part of me, emotionally, that feels sadness for what was, but no more than when I go to a childhood destination and see that it's been destroyed. Because it's evolution. These mainstream media outlets don't deserve to be relevant anymore. They've lost our trust, and they deserve exactly what's happening to them.
So true or false? The Founding Fathers, I think, saw media as a way of keeping the government in check. It was there's the executive branch, judicial branch, and then the congressional, the legislative branch. But the media was designed to keep all those people honest, and they were given protections to make sure they could do such. And those arguably have been commercialized in a way that now it's more about the profit of the media than it is about the keeping the society in check with really good facts.
I would say it's become almost, I agree, but I would take it even a step further. And I don't want to, there's some mainstream media reporters who I'm still friends with. This is my group, and they're doing great work, but they're restrained. They're very restrained. They're working with handcuffs on. It's not just that they're looking for profits. They're trying to be on the side of authority now. It's almost the exact reverse. So you have a lot of the mainstream media outlets which were holding authority to account, and they're now working on behest of authority. I got to tell you, nothing makes me angrier than these asshole reporters out there talking about the need for censorship. You're a reporter. Like, that's our livelihood. Disagree with me all you want. Yeah. And I used to be a mainstream reporter. I was at the fifth biggest paper in the country. I was on MSNBC, Fox News, CNN, Good Morning America. I did all the shows. I was always talking, and now I'm kind of like a heretic because I'm viewed by my former colleagues, who I respect a great deal. But I can feel it, right? It's like, what happened to me? I went off the deep end. And I look at it a little bit different. Maybe I did go off the deep end a little bit, but it's because the plank I was walking on had been corrupted.
But you agree that, I mean, journalists need accountability to what they're saying. Like, they shouldn't be able to.
Accountability only by the people who. So I'm a very free speech absolutist. Yeah. So I think they should have the right to report wrong things. So I'm going to say something that 90% of your audience is going to disagree with, maybe more. Alex Jones, who I can tell you his followers have gone after me for my book on Newtown, but it's ridiculous that he was bankrupted because he said something that wasn't true. He said that the shooting in Sandy Hook never happened and was a government, plot, and he was sued for that. Well, I think what he said was disgusting, but the fact that they were able to bankrupt him is sad for America and sad for free speech. And I push back on any sort of notion on the limiting of information and the ability to discern it, because you really can't control you can't control speech without controlling human minds. And my philosophy, and we spoke a little bit about it, is just that that's what humans are. Like, you separate us from our ability to have thoughts that are independent and make choices. What does that make us? We're like animals then.
I'm huge on like personal accountability and personal responsibility and autonomy. And this free speech thing, I think I'm close to where you are, and I haven't thought through this like you have. So let me just arm wrestle for a second here. I think people need to be accountable to what they're saying, and if they're giving misinformation, I think there needs to be accountability. And what that looks like is like maybe like, hey, like, I'm labeling this as a fact, I'm labeling this as an opinion, I'm labeling this as a heuristic, but that way people can at least know where people are getting their information, so that I can't lay something down as a fact that I know is not. I think there should be accountability for that. Randy disagrees, I can tell.
Yeah. Who's the arbiter? I mean, who says what is a fact? I mean, we just went through 2020, and all of these people were deplatformed, lost their right to free speech. The President of the United States was kicked off Twitter, for God's sakes. And now all of the crap that they said, you're wrong, this is a fact, this is science, they're backtracking on. I mean, the U.S. Congress just came out and reported, and almost, I mean, Fauci has I don't want to get too controversial with Fauci and all that, because that's not the purpose. I want to get into food here. But almost everything that Fauci stated as fact, he has now backtracked.
Yeah, I think that, again, as a scientist, it's like, here's what we know today. And I think any great scientist, even a good scientist, would say, like, what we know today is going to change tomorrow. And so in a perfect world that's never going to exist, I would just want people to know what we think we know, and then let people have the information to discern themselves what they want to do.
Yeah.
Like, I think
that's free speech, because
the
other way, somebody has to decide what is right and what is wrong.
But we have people, though, and this is maybe part of the authority problem, and that authority problem is that we don't know who the authorities are. Like, here, I'll give you a real example. I was going through this with a drug recently, where someone was making claims about what a drug could and couldn't do. And my chief medical officer and I both went to all the foundational research. We looked at all the outcomes, and they were all correlated outcomes, not causal outcomes, and that wasn't called out in the science. And so we went to our patients and said, hey, look, here's the deal. That science, they're making these claims, and those aren't true. Here's the underlying research. Here's what actually happened. And here's the anecdotal things that people are saying. And so you can believe the correlation, or you can, whatever decision you want to make with us, but we're the clinicians. We're going to tell you what the science is actually saying at the study level, and then we'll make a decision along with you. And I think that's the type of conversation I would hope is happening for people more broadly. It's like, let's talk about what the study really said. And peer reviewers today aren't holding researchers to that level of, they're just not. Like, our peer reviews are weak today compared to what they were decades past.
John, something in an area you've helped me, you've told me, Randy, there is the world the way you want it to be,
yeah,
and then there's the way it is. And I might hold a mirror up to that. Same
I
thing,
think that's.
right?
I just the question is there a policy that could
Right.
do that without limiting free speech? Like, could we put policies in place that would put protections around the kind of mental manipulation that information is having on us today, and still allow or do we just have to deal with it as it is and have totally free speech?
If you could explain to me a way where we can limit people's speech without limiting their thoughts, I'd love to hear it. I don't know how we get there.
I don't know if you limit it as much as you just flag it for what it is.
By who and for what reason?
I don't know.
By what
If you get
standard?
into like the FTC or the FDA, then you have all kinds of problems there too, right? Like everybody's.
I mean,
Yeah.
they're wrong about everything. They lie constantly.
Yeah.
And as you said something I think is really profound and very true, is that status, the conventional wisdom today will change in 50 years. And any inhibition of people's ability to express thoughts and feelings, I think, comes to the root of thwarting evolution.
We're going to slow that down if we limit people's thoughts. We're going to slow down the evolution, slow down the improvements, of progress
Especially
that
the
we have.
bad thoughts. I mean, I can tell you as somebody who, wrote a book on Newtown, that the government lied about a lot of it. That is true. Like, the kids died, they were shot by Adam Lanza, but the government concealed information I was able to access. And when they did that, it fueled a lot of conspiracy theorists who could point to areas where the government repressed information, and then that lack of sunlight drew all kinds of wacky conspiracies that were just not true.
Was any of that information? I don't know the story well at all. What would be one example of a detail that was concealed?
The Connecticut State Police report came out and said that there was no evidence. Nobody knew. They acted like it was a weather event at the shooting. The FBI was at Adam's house years earlier, and Adam was on
Got it.
social media platforms where he was expressing the view that children should die. Like, he was on radars. They weren't responsible, but it was they withheld that information from the public. And when that became known, I mean, this is now known.
Yeah.
It fueled a lot of conspiracy theories who said, no, it actually never happened. The government actually did this. It was a false flag mission, which is what Alex Jones espoused. That's false. It did happen. I was at the funerals of these children.
Yeah. Is there ever something that the government should withhold in terms of information?
We can get into national security debates. I can't. It's interesting because in theory, people can make really compelling arguments for national security, but
So maybe.
But when you look at what they do withhold, it's almost always to cover their own asses.
Yeah.
It's such a slippery slope, right? Because just look at how much stuff they redact now in any report.
Yeah.
And again, we come down to humans and their incentives. And a lot of this you cover in the book is talking about people doing things for their incentives, right? But if you give somebody that power, even if you get the most noble person in the world in that office, their successor isn't going to be the most noble person in the world. And somebody's going to abuse that power.
Yeah.
If you give it to them.
It's a sticky wicket.
And I'm an adult.
Yeah.
Why are you withholding information from me? I'm an adult. Like, what is this? You're going to tell me what to eat and drink and how to... I have very libertarian leanings, if you have, but especially with free speech, because it goes to the human mind and what I think.
It's the First Amendment.
Yeah.
It's not the Second. It's literally the First Amendment. And
I think
it's a core value of this country.
I think where I'm a little slightly different is I think that people need to be accountable to what they say, so they can't just like character assassination should be out of bounds, right? Like I think there are things that that don't help discourse, that don't help the conversation. And when I say I disagree with your actions or I disagree with this policy, I'm all for that. When I say you're an a-hole or you're this or you are this, you are that, I'm characterizing things without any underpinning evidence or like give me the evidence that you don't like about how I act. But I do think that I think limiting character assassination, that shouldn't be free speech. I shouldn't be free to give you my characterization of something without give me the underlying things you don't like.
But again, who is going to make that decision?
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't thought that far through. This isn't. I mean, my fight's with chronic disease, but
I mean, you're putting a lot of faith in some random bureaucrat.
And also, I think that the person who would make those allegations
AI
on
is never
you,
biased ever.
if I were to come out here and, for instance, and say a bunch of racist garbage, your listeners would not buy my book, and I would probably not get on a lot of other media circuits. And that to me is called accountability, and I think that's good. I think that would be a positive reaction to racist, vile comments, and I think you see it every day. I'm all for cancel culture. I think it's the free market. as long as it's a free market and people are making those decisions to cancel individuals based on thoughts they disagree with, that's...
Isn't cancel culture about silencing people, though? I mean, isn't that shutting discourse down?
When individuals make the decision to cancel another individual and say, I'm blocking you because you said something disgusting, I may or may not agree with the disgusting comment, but I think people have the right, and I agree with their right, to limit the people they're exposed to, because you do get a lot of garbage,
but
especially on social media.
But that flows out. Stanford had this problem where they brought a judge in that people didn't like, and they tried to cancel the judge, and the dean of the law school came out with a really eloquent, it was like 10 or 13 page paper that said, like, hey, we're here to learn about discourse. Like, you may disagree, but that doesn't mean we can then shut them off of a academic institution where ideas are the point of what we do here.
They were probably talking about firing him, right?
No, he was a guest speaker.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and they wanted to not have him come as a guest speaker, and they were trying to cancel him in that way, is my recollection. Someone has to fact check me on that one.
There have been several instances of this at college campus.
I love how the argument happens, though. Like, that's where it should be played out. I think the protester should be able to protest that person coming.
Yes.
And then the dean can defend it. What I don't want is the government coming in and having a panel that says, you're allowed to do this and you're allowed to do that. This is hate speech. This is not hate speech. That's where you get into really dicey areas that I think limit thought. And then people are afraid to express honest opinions. And that's another whole dangerous side effect, consequence.
Yeah, I think there's another line. And I don't know what it is because this isn't my area, but I think there's a line with character assassination and hate speech that probably is a place we could draw a very bright line that isn't like governmental overreach. But I don't, again, not my area of expertise. I would be...
Let's go back to your original premise of the Founding Fathers.
Yeah.
Benjamin Franklin there's few people that have had their character assassinated more than him.
Yeah.
The Penns and it's been a while since I've read on this, but I'm pretty sure it was the Penn family.
And he had his fair share of it too, by the way, under a pen name.
Yes, he had multiple pen names that he wrote in his own newspaper making arguments. And the Penn family ran a different newspaper and they went back and forth. Yeah. And he came out of it okay. Like, he still came out of it as an American hero. And even with George Washington, when Washington took New York, I forget what the newspaper is, and maybe Matthew, you know the story, but there was a newspaper there that the British were using as propaganda, and they had been telling lie after lie after lie. And when Washington confronted them, the guy thought he was in trouble, and Washington's like, "No, we're going to protect the press." Like, he basically forgave him and was like, realized this is, even though they had lied about Franklin, they'd lied about Washington. They went out. The First Amendment was literally to still protect the freedom of speech, and the press was a big part of that.
Like any great scientist, I'm going to say maybe we just need more thought into this. And let me ask you this: then, if we could draw a bright line that was reasonable for all sides, you'd be open to that. You just don't believe the government can do that.
I don't think you have any right to tell me what to say. I think you have a right to ignore me or call me names or whatever you want to say. I just don't think another man or woman has the right to tell other people what to think. I don't
not to think for sure. I think it's the place where I draw the line is character assassination. Like, that's the part where I think real damage is done with very little consequence. And then it's like smoking, right? It's like, you can't tell me to smoke or not to smoke. It's actually, yes, I can. Secondhand smoke hurts me. And so once you do something that infringes on my autonomy, I think there's a line that can be drawn. And when someone gets into a national media platform and does something that is not factually true, that is character assassination, that has a material, in some cases financial impact on my family, my livelihood, then what you're creating is secondhand smoke. And so I don't, again, this is not an area I've thought of deeply, and so I'm not an expert in this space. There's people much smarter than me, but my argument would be secondhand smoke. Like, we got to limit that.
How about this? I think we gave the listeners enough to chew on here.
Yeah, for further conversation some other time.
Let's let them make their own decision.
Yeah, love it.
They know Matthew and I are right. You're wrong, but that's okay. So
that might be true. Look, I think I'm a libertarian at heart too. I think that might be true, but I'm also, I think I'm an optimist like you are, and so I wish maybe I'm wishing for that future, and just not my fight today.
So let's move this to why we're really here. Crime reporter. I remember when I first heard you talking, and you were talking about being a crime reporter, and all of a sudden you're writing about food. And I just thought that was such a weird transition. Now, after reading the book, it was like this aha moment. I'm like, oh, this really is a crime on humanity with food. Like, you were the perfect person. What I thought was odd was actually you were the perfect person to write this book. So thank you for that. But let's take us to the book and how you got there and where How'd you get into this?
Thank you. That's very kind. I appreciate it. When I was 15 and 16, I had osteogenic sarcoma as a form of cancer, and I was I was pretty sick, and I grew up in the 90s when we had the dietary food pyramid, which said that we should have 8 to 11 servings of grains a day. And this was posted on every sandwich shop, every pizza place. It was a free advertisement. I had great parents, like smart parents. And why would they lie about this? You know, they just trusted the science. And at the same time, lard was replaced by the seed oils. That revolution was basically completed in the early 90s. Sugar was looked at as very acceptable. So I was eating a lot of garbage. And when I was sick, I remember asking my doctors, I was like, what did I do? You know, why did I get this? They were like, well, we don't know. You know, it's not your fault though. Probably genetic, I remember them telling me. But I intuitively felt like I had done something wrong. I knew my eating was horrible. I didn't eat a moderate amount of these things. I ate a lot of garbage. So
you knew that at the time?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because when you eat 3 bowls of Cinnamon Toast Crunch for breakfast, even though it says heart healthy on the box, your body's telling you something's goofy. Right? The skim milk. Something was wrong. So health has always been on my mind because part of it is I'm in remission for cancer and I don't want cancer again. And when I became an investigative reporter, which is really just my passion in life, is digging into information and trying to expose these stories. I grew very cynical of government power and corporate power. I've interviewed former presidents and senators and like local government leaders, and there's a lot of corruption, and that was kind of my life. It's like trying to expose this corruption. COVID changed me though, because it was a turn where it was transparently, a lot of it was lies. I mean, COVID was real, and it's like a real virus, but you know, when they told us it didn't come from the lab, for instance, in Wuhan at first, that was something that they said was a crazy conspiracy. It was transparently coming from the Wuhan lab that dealt with COVID, right? The coronavirus lab. So that kind of set me down a rabbit hole where I was introduced to an author named Seyfedin Ammous. He wrote a book called The Bitcoin Standard. I like economics as a peripheral, but I'm not an expert. And he had a second book called The Fiat Standard. And in that he has a chapter with a brief mention about how our food system's been corrupted. And I had a lot of respect for Seyfedin as an economist. I regard him as one of the top economic minds in the world right now. But this was nutty. Seyfedin's not a nutritionist. He's not an investigative reporter. So it's like, what the hell is this? So I began fact checking it, like deep diving into this chapter kind of obsessively. And what I learned was that he had understated the case. And I reached out to him, and I had published books with every major publishing house. I have a really great agent. I knew they weren't going to touch this topic. But at this point,
is that true? I don't know how you published this book. Was it self-published?
I reached out to Seyfedin, and I proposed that he start his own publishing house.
Got it.
And
that was mentioned in the book. It's right at the beginning.
Yeah. And he graciously agreed. And I actually did not think there would be an audience for this book. I thought it'd be like a niche book with saves people. And the reaction has been really overwhelming. It's being translated now into 8 languages. And I could not be more proud of it. I've written a lot in my life. This is the book I'm most proud of, Fiat Food. That's the kind of the short version of how I got into this topic, because again, my health, I think about my health all the time. And then I was able to use my skill set as an investigative reporter to dive into what happened, like the corruption and how our food actually did get degraded. And it, something that kind of pisses me off a lot right now is we're having this moment where we're talking about health a lot. We're talking about, the Maha movement, and we have Casey and Casey Means on Tucker, and they're doing great work, and Kennedy, whose books are fascinating to me, and he also is doing great work, but they're missing like what the evidence shows is at the core of our health issues, which is oddly enough, and I know this sounds like a really wacky rabbit hole, but it's the degradation of our currency. Like that's the real root cause when you break it down and you really drill down. And it took a little bit for me to really grasp this because it seemed so far out there, but the more evidence I dug up, the more apparent it became. And I wrote this book out. It's more of like a passion project that I wanted my kids to read one day.
We can talk about I want to talk about root cause versus catalyst versus correlation here in a minute. But I think the thing that struck me in reading the book, I'm pretty optimistic. I generally try to give like people the benefit of the doubt, best intent, and so I hoped opening the book that I was going to find that science had moved forward. Okay, we thought this in one decade. Decades later, we found more information, and I think that this heartening part of reading the book was not the writing, but you really blew the cover off that one for me. Like, you can't be intellectually honest and say that we just learned more in science. Like that like you can disagree with your view on the motives of the people involved in the book. Like, you could have a debate about that. What you can't debate is that this wasn't just science moving forward. I think that the facts you uncovered pretty clearly say this wasn't science moving forward.
It's sad. I mean, there's a darkness to writing this book that I felt.
Yeah.
In terms of also like liberation, you know, you were talking about what you were doing in treating type 2 diabetes, and what you're doing should be embraced nationwide. It should be embraced all over the world.
Yeah.
But there's a reason it's not being, and you know what that reason is.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about policy level versus community level versus individual level, and one of the big parts of the research was how do you help the individual do something in a policy environment that's not supportive of that. Like, we were very clear about that.
The food, Fiat. Well, tell people what Fiat is, because I don't know that everybody knows this, hears this term, but I don't know that everybody knows what it means.
Fiat means by decree, and in financial terms, fiat dollars mean dollar by government decree. So most of civilization, we've had hard currencies. Our dollar was literally just a note that promises a tangible asset.
Whether you have it or not.
Yes, usually gold.
Yeah.
And your dollar was a promissory note for a certain amount of gold. So for most of the 19th or 20th century, it was $35 redeemed for 1 ounce of gold. And we went to fiat on August 15th, 1971, and we transitioned from our dollar being notes for gold to just government dollars by government decree. And the consequences of that, I think, impossible to overstate how dramatic of a shift that was in America, not just in food, but it's interesting, like, I was looking into aviation and just how in the 1970s, there were people who would fly from New York to London for a day trip and come back that night, have dinner. Like, air times were quicker. Like, there's been a lot of degradation all throughout society. I would argue no more consequential than in the American diet and the metabolic dysfunction that's followed as a result.
I guess one step further, I've heard arguments like, well, but gold, I mean, you can make more gold. You just go mine and find more gold. But that's not the same as printing money.
Of course not. There's effort involved in labor. So there's a restraint on gold that, you know, I used to be a gold bug. I've shifted into Bitcoin because when gold goes up, the world's really big, and it's just gold goes up in price. It incentivizes people to just dig more gold, so the supply can keep growing.
And that's where I didn't understand Bitcoin, and I clearly don't understand it as well as you two do. But the thing that really was it's an arbitrary line at 21 million Bitcoin that will ever be made. It's arbitrary, but it's hard, and it's a much harder limit than the limit of gold or platinum or precious metals or whatever you're going to use as the hard currency. But if you look at it that way, there's an argument to be made that gold is not truly hard currency. I think that's what you were trying to tell me earlier today, Randy, right?
It's hard. It's not the hardest. Bitcoin,
fair
Bitcoin
enough.
is the hardest, right? So
would that be true of any cryptocurrency that has an arbitrary limit? If I said I'm going to have N number of coins, couldn't any?
I think let's shelve that for a future podcast.
Okay.
While we got Matthew here, I think we get back to this because you and I can have a long debate on this.
Fair enough.
So, but let's.
Matthew's not going to take the bait either, huh? All right.
Well, all right. We're right again. You're wrong. That's okay. No, we'll go back. We'll go back to that.
This is eerily similar to my marriage.
Okay.
Like this happens a lot to me.
So let's get back in.
I accept. Let's go on.
Because we could go with Fiat. I think it shows up everywhere, right? I think it shows up in science. I think it's one of the most glaring things. I think it's showing up in medicine, which I'm sure you two could nerd out on for a long time. But let's get back to food. Okay. So how did this start, right? Because it wasn't always this way. I mean, there's a lot of things that come together in the book. So take us through some of those.
So pre-1970, you had a lot of wheels in motion in terms of the food supply already. One of them was the Seventh-day Adventist Church, who was heavily influential in nutrition. Started by somebody named Ellen White, a young woman who was a descendant of the Millerite movement. She was walking home from school one day and gets hit in the head with a rock.
How big was this rock? Because I read this and I'm like, what?
According to her, it's a pretty big rock. It sent her into a coma.
Okay.
And she wakes up from this coma and she's having visions from God. And God is saying, Ellen, the end times are coming soon. We need to purify body and soul for the next place everybody's going. And we need to do that by removing carnal desires, which are actually the root of all disease, she contends. And carnal desires are caused by meat, specifically red meat. Got to get this out of the diet. She goes on a crusade to try to get people to change their habits to purify their souls. And she hires somebody named John Harvey Kellogg, who is tasked with essentially finding an anti-masturbatorial breakfast food that isn't meat. Because at the time, everybody's eating meat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. He invents Kellogg's cornflakes. He gets succeeded by somebody named Leanna Cooper, who founds the American Dietetic Association, which becomes the government arm of nutrition. At the same time, corporations are also at work trying to introduce foods to the American public that aren't really foods. This is something I find to be kind of in my research was really fascinating, was that the early 1900s, Americans just really wanted to eat food. And there was this movement starting, I think, more big catalyst was oleomargarine, it was called. And there were riots in New York for a period of time where people were finding this non-food substitute for butter. And there were court cases and legislation. There's a sordid history. Eventually, people accepted margarine. Crisco was another one where people were like, this isn't food. Why would we eat this? Procter & Gamble made Crisco because the Industrial Revolution had ended and they had all this cottonseed waste. And they're like, hey, let's just try to get people to eat this. And it worked. And they advertised it as like a healthy, really sophisticated marketing campaign. It was genius, actually. Marketing as a cleaner version than lard. And there was actually a marketing campaign to demonize lard, too, which I didn't go into much in my book. Corporations also realized that you make more money on plants than meat. But all these factors are in play. In 1970, Americans are still eating on average 155 pounds of red meat a year. They're eating it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. What happens in 1970 when we decoupled from gold was the incentive structure changed. And then America kind of had to get involved in the manipulation of the food supply, not because they wanted people to get sick, just because they wanted to stay in power and they didn't want people to get upset and panic. When Nixon, to give everybody a little bit of grounding on where we are in 1970, the Vietnam War is happening, and we were committing a bit of a fraud in America. While Americans were no longer to redeem their promissory notes as previously discussed for gold at $35 an ounce, foreign banks still could. So what Nixon realized when he came into office was all it would have taken was a few banks at the same time from other countries coming to redeem their notes at once, and we would be exposed as a fraud.
Because our dollars were, if I remember right, in the book, like 4-1. Is that right?
That's about approximately right. Yeah, we had issued 4-1 more promissory notes than gold we had in our treasury. Right. This was like very.
That was during 1970 or before 1970?
The buildup was before 1970 with the Great Society and the Vietnam War, but it came to a head in 1971 because All it would have taken was like an international incident of some kind where countries wanted to redeem their gold to expose it. So when Nixon, it's not Nixon's sole fault to go off the gold standard. He kind of was forced to. He had very little choice, especially if he wanted to continue the Vietnam War, which was costly. But he hired some guy named, oh man, what is his name? The Department of Agriculture, Earl Butz. And governments are very keen on understanding that people will deal with corruption. They'll still vote you into office. And they'll deal with war. They'll still vote you into office. When food prices go too high, that leads directly to political instability. And they were very, very concerned about not having enough food for the public once they decoupled, because the prices of food was going to rise. And there's no way to get somebody out of office, as Kamala and Joe Biden could attest to, than the rising food prices. So you see this shift in 1971, after Nixon gives what's known as the Nixon shock. This shift where Earl Butz begins consolidating the food supply. His head of Department of Agriculture. He had a slogan which was "Go big or go home," and through fiat dollars, they began printing huge amounts of subsidy dollars for corn, soy, and sugar in a more roundabout way.
And does the government measures the money supply at this point?
Yeah.
Maybe take us. I don't think every listener understands. Like, we talk about, like, in the news, M1, M2, M3 money supply, and I think those are confusing for lots of people. Like, can you explain that just real quickly, what that looks like over time?
I mean, it's interesting because it's varied accounts, and M1, M2, and M3. I don't understand these. I'm not an economist. I don't understand them completely. It's different measurements of the money supply. Some
different
include,
formulas, right?
Yeah, some include, but a lot of it has. When I try to dig into understanding the M1, M2, M3, there's a lot of debate on what they even are amongst the people who come up with them.
But they all show growth, right? I mean, that's
of course.
And that's the thing that is maybe more important.
Yeah,
maybe.
You're printing significantly more dollars, chasing the same amount of goods. But here's what your audience really should understand. If you're eating meat or eggs or animal-based products that our ancestors have had for thousands of years, these foods you can't just print like dollars. So you can up the money supply, and a lot of plant-based products you can basically print like fiat. But steaks, if you talk to a rancher, or especially a good steak, very time intensive. And there was a real fear in the Nixon administration moving forward that what was going to happen was people were going to riot like they did in Sri Lanka in 2022 when the price of food and milk and eggs went up too high. And they stormed the palace and the leaders had to flee. According to American University, there were 12,500 riots in Europe alone that dealt with food and energy in 2022 as well. So leaders have long understood this, but if you're just
but they did this by subsidizing those grain production, and because you could
first
do it in a more like compact way on farms, and it's harder to do that for meat and eggs and poultry because it takes more resources per calorie, I guess is the argument.
It's very much more resource intense to do. Like, you can print Doritos like you can print fiat dollars. So right now I have 4 daughters, and I could keep them fed by giving them 4 boxes of cereal. And by that criteria, food's actually really cheap. We're all happy. But for the nutrients needed to thrive as humans, food's becoming cost prohibitive.
Yeah.
And right now we're in a situation where red meat's increasingly becoming a food of the upper class. And you see the results all around on this shift. Like, pre-1970, a lot of these incentives existed, but it was only once fiat came into being that the table shifted all the incentives in such a way where subsidies flowing to corn, sugar, soy, and then this nutrition science gets funded to perverse. Like, pre-1970, the government would talk about nutrition a little bit, but basically nobody needed to buy my book or to listen to these podcasts on nutrition because people knew what to eat. The same way a lion knows what to eat. Nobody was like, what do I eat?
Look at a picture of a beach in California in 1960 and you see, like, no obesity whatsoever.
It's shocking, isn't it?
Yeah.
Or the Star Wars line pictures. Like, find a obese kid. It's difficult to do. And it wasn't that the kids weren't, the kids were still eating not 100% meat, but the diet and the incentives weren't shifted in such a way, like, where today if you want to eat healthy and people really understood how inflation and the amount of bills, despite all the technological advances in livestock raising, you still can't get a decent ribeye for under $24. It's really difficult. And ground beef is still okay, but that's becoming cost prohibitive. And you see this, what is essentially a 55-year gaslighting campaign to convince us to eat shit and to eat. And now, like, if you go to New York City now, you see, like, young girls virtue signaling, like, while they're taking their skin off of lean chicken, like eating like 14th century peasants. I mean, it's become unreal. And when I really dove into how quickly this transformation happened, I mean, essentially, like, your great-great-grandmother was right. Like, the foods that she ate a lot of organ meats, a lot of meat, plants sometimes, but every meal relied on meat. It was based on meat. And you could walk to any Walmart right now and look in line and see the devastation in terms of human life.
You look at the biology, as I understand it, and again, not my area of expertise, but read stories about how when the human became really smart and the brain really started growing, it's when we figured out how to eat protein in bulk. And I think Born to Run might have been the book where I read it, and it just talked about how we finally learned how to hunt and bring down meat on a regular basis. And that was a real inflection point for the growth of the human. And so interesting to see us kind of go the other direction.
And it's not just, it's sad, because I don't find there to be like a conspiracy where people gathered, and nobody in my research really wanted to make people sick. That wasn't the motivation. Corporations were just motivated to make money. They're obligated to their shareholders. So if you go to, I live 18 miles from the Mexican border, you go to Mexico, they put sugar in their Coke. We put corn in ours. Why? Not because corn's worse for us to eat than sugar, by a lot of metrics. The corn syrup, the high fructose. Not because it's, they're trying to make it sicker, it's because it's cheaper for them. And you find all these real ingredients being substituted for less healthy ingredients because the financial incentives have shifted, a lot of times by government decree.
And in Europe, this is different, right?
Yeah.
I don't know all the technical differences, but
well, there's a lot of toxins. They're more adverse to poisoning their children than we are, so they've outlawed a lot of the toxins. While here,
don't put a sharp point on that though.
I mean, it's true. Like the glyphosate in the flour is different there. There's less chemicals. But
my wife can eat flour in Italy without having any gluten problems whatsoever, but can't eat that here.
My wife's the same.
Even in part of Western Europe, she has problems with it a little bit, but in Italy, for whatever reason, it seems to be not a problem.
And it's not a coincidence. It's because of what we're doing to our food supply here, and we have the illusion of abundance. That's the key. It's like you go into a supermarket and the person who making minimum wage can buy all the food they could eat, but what we've turned into, it's like chimpanzees who are our closest living relatives, where they eat 95% plants, but they're spending all day eating because they're always hungry, and their bellies are big and their brains are small. And that's what modern day man's devolving into. We're constantly hungry, where obesity used to be a sign of affluence, and now it's a sign of depravity of our of nutrition, because we're always hungry and we're always trying to eat.
By the way, have you seen, I think it's on Netflix, Chimp Empire?
I have seen a little bit of it, and my wife got so disturbed by it that she made us turn it off.
Help me out. Never heard of it.
These scientists go out, and they've been living with these chimps for, I'm probably screwing this up, you got to fact check me here, but 20 or 30 years. And they've been out there, and they recently made a documentary. And Matthew's right, they're up in these fruit trees eating and eating and eating, but what they really want to eat are monkeys. They just don't have access to a lot of meat. But that's probably why your wife didn't like it, is they go out and they hunt monkeys, and they're eating monkeys every chance they get. Like that's their goal. They're eating the fruit because they don't have monkeys.
We all want to be eating monkeys.
Yes, there we go.
We're stuck eating fruit half the time. I don't think fruit's always bad. It's unnatural to be eating raspberries in Arizona all year round. I mean, it's not how we're designed.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, I grew up in Minnesota, and I grew up on a farm. And I go to the grocery store now, and I see all these foods that A lot of them, I didn't know they existed.
A lot of them aren't foods.
Well, but no, I'm
Yeah.
talking even like even kale. You didn't grow kale in Minnesota. I don't know. I think it grows in warmer climates or whatever, but I didn't know kale was a thing. I didn't know bok choy was a thing. There were just a lot of things that you didn't get, right?
Oh, that's interesting.
And you didn't get oranges even, I don't think, unless it was the right season. Where now you see oranges.
Did you ever see pictures of like what fruits and vegetables looked like 150 years ago?
Oh, yeah.
That's a bit shocking.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Heirloom foods,
Yeah.
essentially. Yeah.
They're smaller, I assume, or they're what?
Yeah, like corn was like
And
little-
deformed. They look deformed relative to today, not nearly as uniform. The cool news about this is that we actually have a seed repository where we could go back to all of that, where it's not genetically modified if we chose to. Like we've been storing seeds for a very long time, so if we ever decided that we were on the wrong path, we actually could go back if we wanted to hit the reset button.
Well, there's seed
I don't
banks.
think we will.
My wife has recently become a master gardener out in Bastrop, and so there is something I've heard that I don't know enough. I just know enough to be dangerous, but they've got a seed bank there that they will share with people if people want seeds. That people can go.
I think this topic's
Yeah.
fascinating. I'd love to hear. I don't know a lot about it
Right.
either. I just know there's like seed wars, and there's the government keeps seeds, and some seeds are illegal,
Yeah.
and it's interesting. I don't go into that in my book at all, but
Oh yeah, I mean the
if
intellectual
you have a guest
property,
on that, I'd love to hear about
Yeah,
it.
we need to talk to someone about the intellectual property rights and how intellectual property law has been used to kind of take out the people that want to keep growing non-GMO products. And I think Food Inc. was a documentary that I watched how that was, and you know I'm a capitalist, so but I think capitalist unchecked can be pretty dangerous, and so I think when you take decisions out of people's hands, that's a tough thing. Right? So if you have a farmer who wants to keep their own seed, but they're forced to use seed that's been genetically modified because it blew over their fence, like that's how people are using intellectual property law at least several years ago. And if that's true, which again, not an expert here, that would really be disheartening.
Well, okay, so we've got the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We've got the government that is trying to keep inflation down. We've got corporations trying to make money. I know when I talk to people about this stuff, a lot of times they're like, oh, come on, Randy, like this is too conspiracy theory. My government doesn't lie to me. Like these people, yeah, they're not, they lie over here, they do this, but they really have our best interest at heart. I mean, take people through that more. Like what are these people doing? Like there's really this three-headed alliance here, right? All moving in the same direction.
Yeah, let me spell it out for you in a really interesting period of time in January of 2023. In the first week of January of 2023, you had the Tufts Food Compass come out. Now, this is the leading nutritional guidance offered in America. These are individuals who all of their life have studied nutrition. This is their thing. They have very fancy credentials. They determine and they share, first week of January 2023, that Fruit Loops are healthier than eggs. 55 General Mills and Kellogg cereals are preferable over red meat. Cheese. Soy chocolate milk is preferred over whole milk. These are what our geniuses are telling us. Same week, 60 Minutes airs renowned journalist Leslie Stahl as a large segment, I believe it was 14 minutes, on Ozempic, Wegovy in particular, and these weight loss drugs. They have Dr. Fatima Stanford, very eloquent, white coat, talking about new science. She's cutting edge. New science reveals that obesity is not a result of lifestyle choice. It's actually a genetic brain disease. I find this woman despicable. One of the worst forms of human life. Because what she's doing when she's saying that, and I believe she knows better, she's clearly bright, is you're undermining people's ability to be in control of the most fundamental aspect of their existence, their own health. And she's saying, you're not in charge of your own health anymore. But we have these drugs. Barely mentioned in this clip was that she was also a paid hack for Wegovy, Novo Nordisk, the parent company of Wegovy in particular. The only other expert interviewed was Dr. Carolyn Aprovi. Also, not somebody you want babysitting your children. Talking about how great Wegovy is. Also a paid consultant for Wegovy. All right, the show is sponsored by, your audience guessed it, Wegovy. It was essentially a commercial. It was PR. That same month, January 2023, American Pediatric Association, for the first time in 15 years, changed their guidelines. So now children as young as 15 should be suggested these weight loss injections, which you have for life.
Well, that's debatable. Like that point's debatable.
About the life?
Yeah, we can talk about that a little bit.
Well, what do you mean?
So our medical practice, we use those types of drugs all the time, and there is no science that says for life or not for life. Our working theory is that we will be able to help people change their behavioral lifestyle so that you can then come off those drugs. So we've already started. So those are drugs that you start at one level, you titrate them up to higher dosages, and then you can titrate them down to lower dosages. And our hope is that we can then titrate people off of the medicine in the same way you can get somebody off of insulin.
Okay, so that's great that you're doing that. Novo Nordisk, in particular, in a letter to their shareholders,
said it's for life, and they want it to be for economic reasons.
Of course,
that I think are, again, that's the difference between marketplace and science, right? Like, I'm interested in the clinical outcome.
You're not beholden to your shareholders, are you, John?
I do have shareholders, but
do you really?
Yeah, we have shareholders in our company, but what we told our shareholders is that profit is going to be a byproduct of a clinical outcome, and if you don't like that, then you should not invest.
Is the Trump administration listening to this? They should be having you on one of their panels because, as an advisor, because that structure is something that I think would make progress in this country.
Well, it has to. It's economically, medicine's not feasible on the path that it's on. The trajectory is unsustainable for us, and I think everybody knows that if they're being intellectually honest. But look, if the people who make Wegovy, Ozempic, Mounjaro, Zepbound, and then all the generics, like, I'm a huge fan. Please keep doing the research. It's a miracle drug. It really is amazing, and I think we're going to find some other side effects likely if the anecdotal data is right that show other really, really positive benefits for other disease states. And there's a right time that people may be able to come off those drugs, as they can with insulin or metformin or other drugs that we get people off all the time, because food is medicine too, when the food is done correctly.
I'm a little suspicious of the fact that this food compass came out, this 60 Minutes advertisement came out, and the American Pediatric Association changed their guidelines all within the same 45-day period. And I looked for some sort of collusion. I found none. But I'd be a little naive to think it was all just like a coincidence. That doesn't mean it wasn't, but it's kind of like, look, you're not in control of your health. Just hand it over to us. We have these medications, and the incentive system where everybody was profiting. So you were asking me earlier just how crazy this conspiracy sounds. I would point to the gaslighting campaign that kind of made us think inside this box and not be able to think out of it, where we're now looking at food. Like, a great percentage of people don't make the connection. I have family members, and it's like really hard for me. They don't make the connection at all between what they eat and they can back it up with credentials. They can say, well, look at these studies. Look at all these people. They're telling us to eat nothing but grains.
See, this is my frustration. We talked about this earlier. In one breath earlier today, you said free speech. People should be able to say anything they want, which means Wegovy should be able to pay for time. And then you say, well, look at the research. And my answer to those people will be, great, let's go look at the research. Not let's set about the research. Let's actually go into the actual studies, because I think peer reviewers are failing us right now. In not every case, not all the time. But there's enough science that's published in journals right now that wouldn't have made it past peer review decades past. Like, I just think I'm back to what we started with, which is, shouldn't someone be like...
Well, I think fraud by a company. If you're packaging baby formula and putting arsenic in it, you should be liable. Okay. That's not free speech. That's fraud.
Okay.
And that's where the other argument I would make is that free speech between people is one thing. When the government imposes mandates and gets involved, then it's coercion.
Yeah.
But I think, John, I don't want to take us down this rabbit trail so much because I don't want to spend the time on it. But I think that if you get to why is the peer review failing us, I think we're going to come back. I'm
I think it's talked
certain
about. Yeah,
we're going to come back to the money.
If you don't
right?
talk about it in your book, at least you
yeah.
allude to it. It's the same thing, right? I think we have the same types of variables making influence in two different ways. So it's the same problem in a different place, right?
We're going to come back to the money, right?
Follow
and
the
it's,
money.
And it's the incentives. Mm-hmm. Just like with the food.
I think that's
that
right.
We've got government with an incentive. We've got corporations. We've got, we've got religious groups. Medicine and the people being funded by the same broken money have also broken incentives.
But there's one part of the book that I think is probably pretty natural for you and Randy, and that's this piece about Bitcoin. And, Randy corrects me that, he's not long on cryptocurrency. He's long on Bitcoin very specifically as a hard currency. And it was a really, your book actually on Fiat Food helped me understand Bitcoin better, helped me understand fiat currency better. And so take me through that third part of your book where you kind of brought it all together.
I'm not an economist. So when I'm writing, and I think Randy is probably far more eloquent than myself on this topic in understanding Bitcoin. I do understand Bitcoin's capped. I understand it's a hard currency. I used to be a gold bug in terms of my economic policy as an old school Austrian. I never accepted Keynesianism. It's stupid.
By the way, yours is the first book I've read that made such a clear distinction between Keynesianism and the Austrian School of Economics that I think it finally stuck. I've been trying to figure out how to, and I think you made it so real with the stories that I'm going to remember the difference now, even though they should be easy to remember.
Did you take economics classes in college?
I did, both in my master's degree and my undergrad, and also in high school. But I just, I knew the two different schools of thought, but I could never remember who's who. And now, because of the stories, I'll remember who's who.
Yeah, I mean, I tried. I loved economics as a kid, but whenever I got into it, I was exposed to Keynesianism. And at first, I thought I just wasn't smart enough because this is so complicated. And then when I got a little older, I understood that it's just actually really dumb and that I wasn't stupid. I was just like normal and understood that, wow, so maybe if I'm a kid with a lemonade stand and I should reinvest my money not in my own business, but into the government because of the Keynesian multiplier effect. At its base, Keynesianism is just an excuse to print more money. And it's a justification that, you see like the New York Times old theater critic who's now masquerading as an economic leader, Krugman. He's just a court jester for the central bank. Any economic problem, the solution is always we need to print more money to increase government growth. So I've understood for a long time that fiat currency was bad. Because what it does is under fiat, you don't actually own your money. The ownership of your money is a slogan because there's an unelected central bank that could just print as many of your $10 bills in your wallet as they want. And if you go to the roots of fiat, you go to World War I. So there's the tie between fiat and war is really interesting. And if you look about history between the Napoleonic Wars of 1815 and World War I, the world was pretty much under a gold standard. And the world was at an unprecedented peace.
But there's another leader who did this even before then in your book, who was a warlord.
Kublai Khan.
Kublai Khan.
Yeah, that was interesting too. In World War I, in particular, under a gold standard, if you wanted to have war, you needed the consent of the public, or you needed to confiscate their gold because war is expensive.
Or get another country to help out, or you had to do the hard work of.
Exactly. So you find that wars were often short because it was cost prohibitive for leaders. They don't want to funnel their money from their own treasury. So in World War I, they met this issue, Great Britain did, where they wanted to keep war going, but the people didn't want it. So they first tried selling war bonds. People were like, we actually don't want this war. We're not going to buy your bonds. That's where John Maynard Keynes came involved. He came up with a way for them to print currency that wasn't actually tied to the metal. And that was the start of fiat. And it's really fascinating because now I don't want to get too into weeds in this, when we had a Bretton Woods agreement post the war, where all the other countries in the nation agreed to pin their dollars, their currency, to the American dollar, which was then pinned to gold. And when Nixon broke that pact, the people were still using the dollar. So it's not a coincidence that since 1971, America's been at war every single year except 1976, 1977, 1978, 1997, and 2000. It's because now we don't need to have gold to commit war. We can weaponize the productive labor of not just America, but since Bretton Woods, the entire world, to keep war going. And what's a really messed up concept is when you get to the point where you understand that the goals are never to really win or lose the war. It's to just keep the war going. And it's similar with health. I don't feel like these people that's the incentive.
You said it's the goal. That's the incentive. So
that's the incentive.
Maybe it's not someone's stated goal, but the incentives, whether you like it or not, are aligned to that.
Of course. And same with health.
But who's benefiting? So let's dig into that a minute. Because I 100% agree with you. And you're hitting one of my hot buttons now, right? Because the war thing, I'm about as anti-war as you can get. So who's incentivized, or whose goal is it to keep it going?
Oh man, so I'm not a great expert on this. There's a lot of contractors. We live in Arizona by I think it's called Raytheon. There's a very Raytheon, it takes over half the state, it seems. There's a lot of money that goes on. Also political power. I mean, think about George Bush. He was never more powerful than after 9/11. And it's amazing that we are able to because what happens under fiat is when the government prints money, they are not just printing paper, they're printing productive labor, and it gets siphoned from the current holders of money. So it's not a coincidence that the wealthiest people in America are the people most in debt. Because when I was little, I used to think that when a loan was made, people were going to buy a new house, it was taken from other people's money who had put money in a bank to get an interest rate. No, under fiat, the money is printed. So what happens is it's created. It's new money that comes into the system, which is why there's a correlation between interest rates.
No matter whose money it is, if I take debt today and I pay it with inflated dollars tomorrow, I win. Like debt today is an inflation hedge.
Of course. And it's like you hear these financial experts, who are sort of dated. They have your grandmother's advice, which was great under a gold standard. Save. Pay off your debt. Under fiat, we live in a bizarro world where if you have a 2.7% interest rate that you did 4 years ago on a 30-year mortgage, you're an idiot if you pay that off. Because you might not be able to buy an extra value meal 15 years from now with your current mortgage payment today. It's cost prohibitive under fiat. You can see
some of this in Zimbabwe where they had like super hyperinflation.
Of course. Or look in America. In 1908, if you took a $10 gold coin and you buried it, dug it up 10 years later, you could reasonably expect that $10 gold coin would have a significant increase in purchasing power due to technological advances. Do the same with a $100 bill. See where it gets you 10 years now. We don't have to guess. That stings a little. We can look back 100 years, right? We don't need to guess where this goes. Yeah. Like we're idiots if we don't see. And it's increasing. It's increasing, which is why the gaslighting campaign's going to only increase. Why we're going to have all kinds of powerful pushes to get away from meat and animal-based products, which you can't create at scale.
And so Bitcoin solves this?
Well, the way I put it is Bitcoin.
Before we go to that, good question. Let's put a pin in that just for a minute. I think the thing for people to remember, again, so many people just have a hard time believing their government and all these people in authority are lying to them, right? But if you look at the incentives, whether it's Raytheon or a Halliburton or whatever defense contractor, they are getting rich as hell from all of this. Like, while Matthew was talking, I Googled how much money is spent on defense lobbying. And I don't know the date, but so far in 2024, over about $111 billion partway through the year.
I think the challenge people, and this is where I think, as a communications guy, where I do have some expertise around human behavior, I would say part of the reason that there's a couple things going on I think that we should be aware of. One is that, if the pain of having a hard currency is real, like because you have to deal with real economic consequences of things, how much a war costs, among a whole lot of other things, that some people would rather be just let the government handle it as like a emotional opioid, right? And so it's less painful and it's less in your face. You don't have to deal with the problem front and center. And so you have the difference of a frog being in boiling water versus the temperature being turned up 1 degree at a time. It doesn't feel differently, but it kills you all the same. So I think that's one part of it. But there's a second piece too, and that is when we use really sharp language against someone's existing beliefs, it bounces off of them versus them really considering it. So when you say like, hey, so-and-so's lying, that may be true. But it's harder to digest that than saying, hey, like this information, they may have the best of the intentions, but the underlying facts don't support that. So let's be honest about the incentives in play, and then let's evaluate. And I hope that people start to do more of that evaluation, more of that introspection, and say, I'm not going to make a value judgment whether they're lying or not, because the motive doesn't even matter. The fact that they're wrong is what matters.
I would argue that Dr. Darish Musafarin, who I'm probably saying his name wrong, the leader of the Tufts Food Compass, he knows that red meat does not cause diabetes, which is something that he put out. I would have to think he was a complete moron to believe that. Or Paul Ehrlich, who wrote The Population Bomb.
That might all be true.
Who's still positing these insane theories. They're propagandists, and I think they should be called out for such. Or you could just be a much nicer person than me, John. I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Maybe. I'd prefer to see that I'm more pragmatic, which is I don't like you could be right or wrong about them being a liar, knowing, not knowing. I just want you to be honest about red meat so you can make a good decision. And if I have to choose which hill to die on, I want to die on the red meat hill, not that this guy's a propagandist or not hill. And so if I only get to battle in one war, I just want to choose my war. My war is about the food, not the person. And I'm not even saying you're wrong, by the way. I'm just saying I'd prefer not to even enter my energy into that debate. I'd rather get to the real debate, which is, right, like whole foods are better for you than processed foods.
Yeah, I think it might be a negative part of my character. I take this all very personally.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like what they've done to the public is disgusting.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm harsh on these people, and I do it with full intention. And I think they should be shamed, and I think that's appropriate.
I do too. I think it is a war in itself, right? I mean, the fact that, again, if this number is right, 111 billion and 2024 is not over. Just split up 111 billion dollars by how many people are in Congress. That's a lot. That's a big incentive for people to keep war going.
Look,
right?
You're both probably right. I'm just suggesting that the approach we're taking right now is not as effective as I wish it would be.
This is something my wife tells me all the time.
But I also think that it's important for people to understand this, because most people still, even if you ask them, is the government honest? They say no when they're taking a poll.
Yeah.
But they still follow the guidelines. They still listen, whether it's food or whatever. They still believe these people have their best interest at heart. And I don't think that until they realize that those people are just human beings, and if somebody gives them all of this money to vote a certain way, whether it's supporting war, whether it's supporting crappy, healthy, poison food, or whatever it is, that self-interest drives so much of what happens in the world. It's not just us. This is all, it's human.
And you want to talk about incentives. So we go back to this, what I term an awful human being, Dr. Fatima Stanford. Did she get laughed at or mocked, really, or face any consequences for saying that people have no control over their own health, their weight, that it's a genetic brain disease? No. I'll tell you what happened to her. She got appointed to the American Dietetic Council, which is going to be the decision-making for the next food guidance nationally, which will be imposed on every hospital, prison, and most consequentially the public school district. And what they've done to the public school district, I mean, most people come out metabolically compromised, and I have a lot of compassion for people who are overweight, because I was overweight too. I mean, I ate the food at the public schools where the whole milk was substituted for skim, flavorless milk that nobody drank, so they had to infuse it with almost as much sugar as Coke and Pepsi. And they took out the lard that fried the chicken nuggets, and they put in seed oils, and they took out the real cheese and they put in like whatever that stuff is. I mean, these kids they have no shot. And by the time they're out of high school, they're already sick, and they're a lot of times like they're going to be visiting you, hopefully, to get things reversed.
Yeah, and there's no doubt we need a policy. There has to be some kind of policy reversal that changes. I'm just not a policy expert. Like that's and candidly, I'm trying to learn more about that world because part of my world's going to bang up into that at some point, for sure. But this is like I've talked to a couple of my friends who are policy experts, and I've just been really honest. It's like I don't know how to fix this, but
one of the solutions I came to, which goes back to Bitcoin, isn't that Bitcoin is this godsend that just fixes things. It's not my perspective. It's that fiat has corrupted it. And when you remove the incentive of fiat to obfuscate the food supply, they're not just going to do it because they're not evil. They're not Dr. Evil in a cave who just wants to hurt people. They need to constantly gaslight us to eat mass-produced waste products to make the food supply seem abundant. It's just in their interest. But when there's a hard currency, there's no reason to do that. And they're not going to do that for kicks and giggles. And it wouldn't just be Bitcoin that would do that. Any hard currency would do that. I happen to think Bitcoin would be the best one because it's just decentralized and harder to confiscate. Gold, look back through history, there isn't an instance where any country has not confiscated their people's gold, even here in America.
Did we have, and again, I'm total naivete here, but did we have this same problem with tobacco? And were we able to solve that problem absent the inflation and hard currency problem, or is this a different problem in your mind?
That's an interesting question. Could you be more specific?
Well, I mean, tobacco was, I think, a product that was pretty widespread for a long period of time, and it wasn't, I don't know if it was healthy, but I don't think people thought it to be unhealthy necessarily, broadly speaking. And then you had all this mass tort stuff that kind of moved people in a different direction, and then I think you had, the makers of tobacco get into the food world, which is, I think, ironic. That's probably a whole other conversation, but like, is there, I don't know, maybe that's sort of different.
I guess I'm not an expert on this either, but I'm at least under the impression that the biggest problem with tobacco is all of the additives they've put in it, right? And that it's not similar to food. Again, I'm so far from an expert.
Let's find
here.
out. Let's go find a guest. I think we'll come back to this one for sure. Because
that's an interesting topic.
Yeah.
I have friends who are insistent that nicotine's not bad for you.
Right.
And some very high-performing friends. And I caught one of my daughters doing Zyn pouches. Not going to name which one. She's not here right now, but she probably won't listen to this. And my wife and I are like, how do we handle this? This is
Randy,
crazy.
let's make a note to come back to that one for sure. And then I'm going to go back to what you said earlier in the show. And I think you just came back around to it a little bit, which is, there's abundance, and then there's the illusion of abundance. And I think people, as a society, I think maybe it would be fair to say that we're okay with the illusion of abundance. And what the three of us would agree on, I think, is we'd prefer abundance to the illusion of abundance.
I hope that's fascinating.
You said it. I'm reflecting back to you.
Wow, am I blowing myself up here? No, I think the way you put it though, I haven't thought of it like, that people are okay. I haven't thought about the idea that people would be okay with the appearance of abundance.
But I think they are, right? Because if you think about the money supply roughly since the Fed was created in 1913, has gone up 7.2%, I think. Call it 7%.
Per year.
On
average.
Which is, by the way, the definition of inflation, I believe this is in your book as well, until at some point, maybe the 70s, you talked this, the definition of inflation was an increase in the budget, an inflation of the money supply.
The root word
right?
inflatio, to inflate.
Right. So that's gone up 7%. If you take a chart and you lay it over top of the stock market, it might look like this or go, up and down, but those lines are pretty much the same line.
I think the stock market broadly is like 9% over the same period, right?
But they're pretty much the same line, and it's because money supply has gone up much quicker, in the last 4 years.
We've only valued, I got it. That's
right.
Okay. I don't know, but that seems right.
That is the illusion of abundance, right? Your portfolio goes up. I mean, we've talked about what $1 million is.
Yeah.
I mean, when I was a kid, when you were a millionaire, you were set. Like if somebody had $1 million, I mean, what was an average house back then? 40, 50, 60. I mean, where I grew up, probably $20,000. But an average house wasn't very much. You could buy a house, you could put that money in the bank, $1 million and let's say the average income, I write about this in my book, I should know, but I'm bad with the specific numbers. But I want to say it was $15,000, $20,000 back then. It was an average income. Well, if you could make 5, 6, 7% on $1 million just putting it in a savings account or in bonds, which in the 70s you could make way more than that, right? But that's like 3 average incomes. Well, today, try and do that today. I mean, you couldn't retire on $1 million, especially after tax. I mean, you could if you want to go live in the woods or something, or in a tent, but it's $1 million just isn't what it used to be. It's not even close. I mean, we've talked about financial finish lines.
Yeah, I'm not one to agree with you this readily, but I think I will in this case, which is that even if you took the net, take inflation out and forget the fact that you could make a lot more in the 70s as a result of inflation, wipe all that out. If you could make the same 2 or 3% on $1 million, it's $30,000 for $1 million, which would be, twice the average income if your numbers are right. I don't know, but so I'm supporting your point that forget the person who's trying to shoot holes in what you're saying by saying, well, you made that money because of inflation, or both. You could take all that out, and Randy's still right. And I think that's the really cogent point here.
But to your point, that's the illusion.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, houses. People buy a house. And having just bought a house, I wanted a new house. I didn't want a house with a 20-year-old roof, a 20-year-old foundation, 20-year-old pipes, 20-year-old everything, right? Because that 20-year-old house is worth less. But not really. If you would have bought the house 20 years ago, it's worth, I don't know, you're way more into real estate than me. What, 4X? 8X? I mean, the price of that house would have certainly gone up.
So Matthew, what does abundance look like? I mean, Randy and I are super interested in abundance in all different ways. So what would abundance look like in a healthy way from your perspective? Food, Bitcoin, have you given much thought to that?
Having control over your time.
Say more about that. I think I'm in if violent agreement exists, I think I'm in violent agreement. But
I didn't come up with this. A good friend of mine told me, who's very wealthy, mentioned that real wealth was being in control of your time. And I think about that a lot in terms of my physical health. Am I captive to an addiction, an illness, a toothache? I can't be my full self. I can't be creative. I can't produce for my family. And am I beholden to do things I don't want to do for other people, to find material goods to satisfy a need that I may or may not have? So that's how, I mean, I wish I could go on longer. I mean, it's pretty simple to me. I just want to be in control of my time.
I'm going to take a second let that one sink in. That is one of the more profound things we've heard on the show.
It's great, right? But that's where Bitcoin comes in also, right? You have to have...
You can preserve your wealth because money is time. And they're not stealing your dollars when they print more dollars and you create debt. They're not stealing your dollars. They're stealing your time. Make no mistake about that. They're taking your time away from you. And we only have so many years. There's so many nights we have. And I want to be able to spend them with my children and my wife. I want to be able to spend a lot of that time by myself alone, too, like in nature.
You didn't see this, but your daughter just chuckled off your shoulder.
That's great. That's
great.
She knows I need a lot of alone time. She does too. But yeah, I mean, I take this. This isn't just an abstract conversation from an academic standpoint to me. This is my life, and I take it seriously. When people push Keynesianism and the need to grow the economy through stealing my productive labor, it's not just my money. Like I work really hard. And I'm glad to. I enjoy work, but it's my work. And I don't appreciate, when my time's taken from me and I'm trying. Bitcoin gives me the ability. I'm not in Bitcoin to make money. I'm in Bitcoin to just preserve my labor. So I was so glad to hear Bitcoin went over 100,000. Obviously, I relished that last night. I was at a Bitcoin event when it happened. It was really cool. Everybody was freaking out. But I just want to preserve my labor, and Bitcoin allows me to do that because it can't be inflated. They can't make more of it. 21 million, that's it.
What are you doing? This is all, again, the book was insanely well researched. It was great stories. The writing was fantastic in terms of drawing people in. That was my experience with the book.
Thank you.
I want to know what you're doing differently. How has all of this really good work you've done changed your behavior?
I eat about 90% animal-based. But the overriding effect it's had on me has been really profound, where I don't look at myself anymore as like, I look at myself very differently in terms of the context to my world. And I'm more in tune with nature, and I look at myself as part of nature. And that comes, the food it starts with, things I consume, but also the information I consume, and even things like sunlight. Like I look at myself more as trying to be in harmony with nature, in that I've done things in my life that have taken me away from that, whether it's too much technology or I go through periods where I'm addicted to news and I'm getting the dopamine hit from MSNBC and Fox constantly, and I have to tune it out. And it shifted this perspective, I guess, just of myself and my place on this earth. I know that sounds kind of corny. I don't know how else to put it though, but it really has. I mean, my priorities have completely shifted. I mean, I used to even think, like we talked a bit about the need to procreate as people. And I used to think about my whole reason to be on earth as I'm a writer and I'm going to write books, and my kind of life will be measured by the library of books my grandkids have access to. And now I look at my primary purpose as like a husband and a father. And I feel more whole and more real. And what people think of me, which used to matter more in the field of journalism when I was the weird kind of outside heretic in New York City journalism, I can't even make myself care that much.
The Maslowian hierarchy of needs, I wanted to point out a moment of genius. You had some humility earlier today, and we're going to play that part back for you.
I talked to somebody the other day, and I don't want to dox this person, so I'll try and make it as generic as I can, but basically, she was eating something really unhealthy, and I just kind of made a comment and just, needling a little bit. But her response was, well, what are we supposed to eat? Like, it was a defeatist, like, nothing's healthy. She didn't say everything causes cancer, but it was sad, right? So what would be your message to people that just feel overwhelmed by the whole thing? Or how do you give them hope? What would you tell them?
Well, the first thing I would say is I understand. We're told a lot of things by a lot of people for a lot of reasons, but you don't need to buy my book to the first thing you need to do is just, like, in terms of diet, just try it for 10 days. Try eating nothing but animal products for just 10 days and just see what your body tells you. And that doesn't mean you never go back to eating other things, but the research is a little varies, but one thing I know is that if I'm eating carbs, I'm not thinking well. I think that physical health presupposes self-autonomy. And if I'm not in a place where I'm physically feeling well, and that doesn't just mean that I'm not aching, that my mind isn't as concise. I'm not experiencing as much clarity, which to me is far worse than physical aches. Then I'm only partially realizing what I am as a human and my ability to exercise free will. Because I'm just I feel like when I'm not healthy, I'm like in the ocean just bobbing with the waves. I'm not a real person. I'm not making these decisions. I'm just going through my existence. I feel the defeat. I know what that feels like, but it's inside of her. But it begins with your health. I mean, really, like, none of us are at our top shape as a podcaster, as an author, to do what we want when we can't think clearly.
That's a great answer.
And I want to underpin the 10 days part, because in the first 3 days you might feel like crap. Right?
Oh,
like that. Like you got to take enough time to get through the decontamination of, I think that's great.
But by the way, I can't remember if it was in the book or I think it was on a podcast I listened to somewhere else. You tried going vegetarian at one point.
It's a nightmare. I play a lot of I run every day, and I'm very I try to be athletic. I play basketball with people much younger and in better shape than me, taller and bigger. So I really tried hard to, like, keep physically fit. And I did vegetarianism, and the truth is, at first it felt great because I was eliminating a lot of toxins. So I had eliminated a lot of the processed foods. But I think within a month, 6 weeks, I felt like a dramatic energy decrease. And I just wanted to be honest with myself because I was all on board. Like I had read a lot of books on it and I was younger. But it was devastating for my energy level. I felt an initial burst of energy. I think that was from detoxing from a lot of processed foods. The carnivore diet for me isn't without flaws. So I want to be upfront with your audience about that. I'm like 90% carnivore, but one of the things I had to add in was I was losing too much weight. So I introduced raw milk and I began drinking a lot of raw milk and it fattened me up a little bit more so I can compete. And I also feel better. I don't think it's great to be in ketosis necessarily for years. The raw milk helps like keep me out of ketosis. I like ketosis. It feels good for short periods of time, but I don't know. I haven't dug into the science on ketosis, so just as a disclaimer.
Yeah, we talk about diet with people a lot in our medical practice, and I would say that as we get into understanding the individual more, each individual is going to figure out what works for them.
Ketosis. So how do you feel? What's your experience?
I mean, look, for me personally, I'll give you my personal experience
Please.
first. I think it's been really helpful for me. Intermittent fasting has been a really important part of my toolkit, and I don't intermittent fast all the time. I intermittent fast at times. And so I think it's a really healtky thing.
How long is an intermittent? Like
you can do it a couple different ways. There's one way to do it is like a 16-8 or like a you can do like even less, like 18-6, where you eat for 8 hours a day or eat for 6 hours a day, and then you don't eat for the other 16 or 18 hours a day. That's one way of doing it.
That's what my daughter does naturally.
A different way of doing it is to do like a 24-hour fast or a 48-hour fast once every week. That's a different way of intermittent fasting. And there's 2 or 3 different ways that people would say it works. The 24-hour fast once a week didn't have the same like physiological impact on me. I didn't feel as good doing it, where 16-8 does. And then I'll do elimination diets in January, where we take a 30-day elimination diet to get all different types of foods out of my body to kind of figure out what's feeling good, not feeling good.
Do you feel, John, I guess both of you, do you feel like a spiritual component to this? And I say this because it is for me in the sense that when I do a fast or when I take the meat away, I'm depriving myself of something that I feel like I'm in control suddenly of my own body. And I can't articulate this very well, but there is this trickle down effect in the rest of my life when I can control this element of it, which is really hard for me. I love sugar. I am completely addicted to it. I cannot moderate sugar. I don't know how people do it. Can't do it. Can't moderate it. Even if I'm having fruit, I'm going to lead to the donuts. It's going to lead. If I have pasta, I'm going to need to eat sugar. It's a mess, right? So I just have to stay away from it. But when I assert that control, I feel as a human just more present. Is this something either of you experience?
Okay, first thing I just want to say, I love what both of you are talking about, individualized health, right? And I appreciate that you're like, this is what I did, and this is what works for me. So I think that's great, and I think everybody's different. I have probably done longer fasts than John. I don't get a lot out of intermittent fasting. I don't know exactly much. But when I do 72 hours, I've done 3-day, 5-day, 7-day. I'll probably never do a 7-day again, but I'll definitely do. In fact, I'm overdue for a 3 or 5-day. I feel stronger mentally. Like I really believe in doing hard things. I just think it does something for, I don't know if it's religious, but it does kind of do something for the soul.
Yeah.
And I think more than that, it's like, I'm a little bit of a psycho. I like to push things, and whatever is good, I want to do more, and I have to kind of control not going to the extreme on it. But it is empowering to just go 7 days without eating and just know you don't have to, and you're okay. And it's one less thing to think about. It's freeing. You stop thinking about preparing the meal, eating, cleaning up. It's unbelievable how much time it gives you. And I think it helps in other parts of life. And I would have to think more about this, but I do think there is something, when we're getting to the soul, we're getting religious, we're getting spiritual. So I think yes, but I don't feel strong.
in the Bible, they talk about prayer and fasting together, right? Like so I think that my initial answer is, all caps, yes, underscore, bold, exclamation points. Like, absolutely, there's a spiritual component. And as a guy who runs a medical clinic, I feel obligated to say that you've got to make sure you're safe in doing this medically. Like, if I have someone that I'm aware of that if they were to go to an all carnivore diet because of their iron levels in their body and other things going on, it'd be incredibly unhealthy. And they would just need to be super aware of that before walking into that kind of diet. I also know a guy who is a type 1 diabetic who uses almost no insulin because he's a very strict vegetarian, whole foods only. And that works for him, although I could never have that diet myself. So I think we have to, as a healthcare profession, move towards individualized decision making. And so our one of the core theses of our practice is that you have an expert plan where you have an expert and the patient planning together and working together to create the plan, not just an expert telling the patient what to do, not just the patient doing things that are uninformed, but working together to have a really good, well-informed plan where the patient and the provider are at the center of that, and the patient's making really informed decisions about their own health and feeding back what's working and what's not working, and having a really good feedback loop. That's a really important part of what has to happen.
If we were to step back a little bit and see like what you're doing, and I just think we're at a really big moment in our country, and I do think there's a spiritual element to it, although as somebody who's not studied in religion, and it's an awakening, and I hate to use words like this because I sound new agey, but there is an awakening happening, and I do think there's a blessed, despite all the horrors of COVID, there is a blessed in people re-examining their lives, and we're living in that, and we're asking questions that haven't been asked before. And you're having me on, whose heretical thoughts are completely off the boundaries in many circles. And there's something really beautiful about that, and I think it comes back down to self-autonomy. I think people are reevaluating their life from their own premises instead of oftentimes, like many, including myself, have done in the past, relying on others to sort of outsource a lot of the decisions we make as just conventional wisdom. Like, this is right, so we do it. Well, now we're like, well, I don't know if that's right. I don't know if that's what we should do. And I think that's great.
I think we're at an interesting time in history. The world is changing, upheaval. John and I have talked before. I don't know about on the air, but we've talked about the fourth turning. And
Sorry, what's the fourth turning?
It is a concept that basically every 80 years, I believe, that society resets itself, and it's a simpler version of it for, I guess, the purpose of the time. You've heard the sayings: hard times make hard men, or hard men makes
good times make soft men.
Make strong man. Yeah, good times make soft men. That whole cycle.
Do you know that one?
I do.
Yeah, that the fourth turning is a different way of looking at that throughout history, and that about every 80 years, society circles back around, and it goes through. We can go from World War II, right? It was hard times making strong men. And then you just look at every generation from there, and kids rebel against their parents to different places where we end up, where we are now with a lot of wokeism. And it seems that we're now transitioning back into another cycle.
Yeah, I feel very optimistic.
Yeah.
I do. And I think I feel that way because of the way information is being freed. How when I was a young kid, it was like ABC, NBC, CBS, and these gatekeepers of information, and it's been decentralized. And then the internet came around and decentralized it for a brief period of time, and then that got taken over by a few corporations, which kind of put us into these, to be blunt, intellectual ghettos, like Facebook, Twitter. But now the podcast has gone above that, and I'm just grateful for this, because this book, which is, to my shock, doing really well, would not be 10 years ago, because I would have no access to the public. When I would publish my books in 2013 through these major publishing houses, I'd have a media person who would get me on big shows, and you'd sell books in spurts. But this is so different, and it's beautiful. I never would have had the opportunity, and it's not just me. You see all kinds of heretical ideas being pushed out into the culture. And I think because of that, there's going to be trickle-down effects that just raise everybody's consciousness to different levels and come to a place of self-empowerment, ultimately.
I think it's really interesting what we're witnessing, and we try to keep this podcast evergreen, but, we recently had the election, and I think it's less interesting that Trump was elected but more interesting who is with him. And, Trump was a Democrat not that long ago. Elon Musk was a Democrat till not that long ago. Tulsi Gabbard, RFK, and all these groups are coming together, and all of a sudden the unions and the blue collar people that have always been Democrats are on his team. And I think that is a sign. I think that society is telling us, it's leaving clues that we are in this change. And I don't know, I don't claim to be smart enough to know where we are in the change, but I think it's, and I would be curious, by the way, as a follow-up, you can comment on that, but your feelings about RFK and what he's doing about, you referenced it earlier, right?
I think
Make America Healthy.
He's a genius, and he's great at describing the symptoms of what's going on. And also, what he's saying about corporate capture is completely true. The ignoring of the currency just makes me feel like we're throwing snowballs on Ferris wheels at each other, and it's very hard to hit it right. One of the things that makes me super optimistic is in this election, more so than any, is that in 2008, there is a popular consensus that demographics was destiny, and that the color of your skin dictated how you voted. And this was widely held consensus among all the political elite. And that went against a worldview of mine. And I was open to being wrong, but no, we're actually individuals, and our skin color does not dictate our belief system. That's insane, and that's actually highly racist and offensive to me. Look who won the election for Trump, regardless if you like him. It was Amish in Pennsylvania. It was Arabs in Michigan. And it was large cities in Wisconsin, Philly, and in Georgia, which people voted different. And that is very encouraging to me, because we're not racial monoliths. We're more than that. We're individual people who think and have our needs. And this political realignment, I love how I have friends who are anti-war, former Democrats, who are now this is basically a third party. There's no more Republican Party. Lindsey Graham's extinct. These Mitch McConnell, warmonger, corporate lover types. Yeah, I mean, this is a weird third party. I don't agree with everything in it, but I do think that the change in terms of getting rid of these political monoliths, the shift in that is encouraging, and I feel hopeful. Again, hopeful. Who knows? I don't know how this is going to end.
I do too. I always go back to the incentives. And I think, I'm so hopeful partially because I've learned a long time ago, don't underestimate Elon Musk. Everything that guy does is shit that people say is impossible, right? I mean, he created a rocket company out of whatever, $90 million or $180 million, when the U.S. government, the Chinese government, the Japanese government, the Russian government, all those people threw all this money and had a 25, 30, 40, 50-year head start. And he did it. So I don't want to underestimate him and what he's doing with Doge. And
you're talking about the government, not the coin.
I'm sorry, man. I actually don't think anything's going to happen with that. I'm pretty pessimistic about Doge.
Right. I'm so hopeful because I love what they're doing, and I don't see how they're going to cut $2 trillion. And I think, recently he caught
without cutting entitlements. The math doesn't add up.
Right. Recently he caught a rocket with a pair of chopsticks. One of the most amazing feats I've ever seen, and I think that's easy compared to fighting all the incentives that broken money has caused in government. I am 100% behind him. Nothing would make me happier than to be wrong on this. And I don't know. I'm going to sit back and eat my popcorn, and hopefully they win and they prove me wrong. But I have doubts.
Yeah, I mean, I've had several conversations, not several. I've had a few conversations with former President Clinton, and it's he was clearly a very bright man. He was interested in people. That was the one takeaway. I didn't get to spend lots of time with him, but he definitely liked people. You could see him talking to the help when the cameras weren't on him. He enjoyed that kind of thing. And there is an aspect of Trump who I met at a 9/11 event once that just reminded me of him. They were very similar and just interested in people. So I hope that you can't be president or run for that office without being a bit of a sociopath, I think. There has to be something kind of wrong with you almost today to run, and the narcissism, and it's a lot. But I'm hopeful. I'm trying to stay optimistic. I don't know. My political allegiances are all over the place. I wish I could go into one box, but I'm skeptical of all of them.
That to me, that says a lot about you, right? Because anybody that is fully in one box is not thinking for themselves. Like, it's almost impossible that they fit perfectly in the red box or the blue box.
You asked me about Kennedy and how I thought he's saying a lot of great things. We had a debate in the car on the way up here about how he is talking about beef tallow going back into McDonald's, and that would be such a positive. It seems small, but it'd actually be huge. Pre-1990, McDonald's used beef tallow. And then through a huge pressure campaign, they got forced to use toxic. I don't even like calling it vegetable oil because that's not accurate. It's not vegetable. It's really that seed oils it's a thing. That's people talk about it a lot. It's like it's legitimately really bad for you from everything I've seen. But is he going to force these companies to do it, or can the incentive structure be switched? Well, if you eliminate the subsidies for corn, suddenly we're not drinking so much fructose in our soda, and we're not putting corn on our pancakes. That's weird. Why are we putting corn on our pancakes, right? It's like all these trickle-down effects that would happen. And if they wanted to do that, it'd be transparent. So if you wanted to subsidize really bad foods for Americans, you'd have to make your argument or sell like bad food bonds or direct taxation. Now they don't need to because they can just print it through fiat. We end that structure. We end that system. We bring back real currency, hard money, whether it be gold or Bitcoin. You put a spoke in the tire of the distortion system that has compromised our food system. And what happens after that is reality reasserts itself. We don't need them to tell us anything. We actually just need the propaganda to end so that people can just make, which goes back to free speech, their own decisions.
You're dealing with a societal opiate, though. You're going to move from painkiller to antibiotic, and antibiotics don't taste as good. They don't feel as good. They just solve the problem, right?
But they're picking winners. What you're getting at is they've been picking winners and losers. Yeah. And I guess I'm never in charge. I'm much like you. I'm very libertarian. I just want the government to stay the hell out of the way, leave everybody alone. So I never want them to pick winners and losers, including forcing people to eat what's healthier. Right. I just want them to leave people alone. But I guess what really angers me, it sounds like much like you, it's not just that they're picking winners and losers, but they're choosing the poison is what they're picking as the winner. Right? So at least if they forced beef tallow, which I'm against them forcing that too, but at least they'd be picking something healthier.
They'd be forcing us to do something that didn't kill us. Right. Yeah, I'm with you. But it's a complicated conversation, and I just think the first step is to end the system of distortion. Yeah. Just then people will fall. Like, people don't want to be unhealthy. People are been told in the 90s Snackwell cookies were good. I mean, cannot tell you how many Snackwell cookies I had. I thought I was eating like a health food. It was all sugar and chemicals. It's nonsense. Yeah. And you see like these shifts to get us not to eat meat, and it went from, like, we talked about John Harvey Kellogg saying that meat caused carnal desires, which caused all health maladies. And this was a very popular assumption at the time. This wasn't like a
which, by the way, belief. You actually underpinned that was partially true.
Of course.
Partially true.
Meat, the connection between meat and carnal desires, there's some really great studies on that. Yeah. And even like, you go back to Roman wars, they'd wait till they had enough meat for their soldiers to go out and fight, to have like vitality and energy. And then it switches like in the 70s in the 40s, it was don't eat meat because we need to save meat for the soldiers. So plant your victory gardens. And then in the 70s, it really hyped up because of, I believe, because of the degradation of our currency to don't eat meat because of overpopulation. And meat was so resource intensive that we were going to all end up eating ourselves if we don't switch to plants. And now it's don't eat meat, as meat is like a thermostat control for the temperature. And we're going to particularly take it out on our children, especially
carbon dioxide for the atmosphere.
Exactly.
Global warming, yeah.
But it hasn't really changed. Like in the 1400s, they used to get eccentric women for changing the weather and make them confess to like changing the weather, crops weren't growing now, and the women would confess and they'd burn them. It's become a little more sophisticated. I'm not an expert in climate science, so just let me throw that out there. But they're weaponizing that, whether it's real or not real. They're weaponizing climate scientists to try to control what we eat, and it's to the benefit of authority to do so, because it, again, is another reason. Now, we talked about personal autonomy, and we have an Italian heritage. I was talking to some of your staff, and how guilt is so fundamental in terms of how to control an individual. Yeah. And if you can make people feel guilty about what they're consuming, then you have a level of control that's not positive.
So you've talked about your hope. I want to know, like, maybe Randy, if you want to keep us here, we can. But I'm interested in going to, like, what's next. What's the next book? How are you seeing the future for yourself? Like, I'm interested in, like, I like how you look at the world, but take me inside your mind. Like, you said you're hopeful. What's the next project you want to work on? What's the next big thing?
I have a movie coming out. I wrote a screenplay. It was my first screenplay based on a book I wrote. And I'm excited about that. The current book I'm writing is on medicine, and I'm going to be in touch with you, John, because I'm learning a lot from you, from our experience here. It's on how the financial system has corrupted medicine and is very connected to food, but very different in other ways. There's been a shift in incentives in medicine as well. And it's fascinating to go back and look at the Flexner report and John D. Rockefeller's involvement in getting rid of a lot of natural therapy and shifting into a pharmaceutical-based, petroleum-based. Yeah. So I'm digging into that, but I don't feel comfortable talking about it to you yet because I haven't done full research on it. Primarily, though, I'm just like everybody else. I'm trying to keep my family happy as can be, keep myself healthy as can be, keep playing basketball, keep running every morning. And
how do like, so for listeners who are interested, myself included, like, how do we get the books? How do we keep in touch with you in a way that you're looking for, readers and listeners to, stay up with the work that you're doing? What's the best way for us to find you?
I'm on Twitter. I'm horrible at social media. I'm not a big self-promoter like I should be for being an author. I just don't like it. I don't like social media. I don't like being on it. My agent's always like, you need to be on Instagram, post 3 times a day. I don't. Something about it bothers me.
So where do we find you on Twitter?
It's just my name, and I'm horrible at it. Like, I'm not pithy. I sometimes try to make like cool comments, and it always comes out bad. My books are available on Amazon, and again, I partnered with Saifuddin Ammous, who I recommend all of his books. He has a publishing house now. He's published Parker Lewis, and I'm going to introduce him to Randy at some point and try to see if that could be a match, because Randy's book sounds fascinating.
What's the publishing house called?
It's called The Safe House.
The Safe House. Okay.
And you could buy in Bitcoin.
Oh, look at that. Shocker. That's great. Is there any questions you were hoping we'd get through today? Things you were like, man, this is the one, or even maybe you thought of during the show, you're like, this is the one thing I was really hoping we'd take this left turn. We didn't make that left turn for you?
Yeah, but I was curious as to like why, and if you're more comfortable talking about this off air, I'd understand how you became sort of a heretic of medicine in many people's eyes. Because I was told type 2 diabetes can't be treated. It's actually, you can't treat type diabetes, so why are you telling me lies and telling me that you are treating it and healing people? That's my question.
Yeah, it's a well-known story. I mean, I started a company in 2014 that was an alternative to health insurance that was helping people pay for their medical bills in a non-insurance format. And we saw lots of chronic disease problems in the same way that insurance companies do. And it came to a head when I visited my mother-in-law in rural South Carolina, type 2 diabetes. She was not well, and she ended up in the hospital for 4 days. And it should have been solvable with, 1 or 2 insulin injections and a blood glucose reading or 2. And so you had this like $100,000 event in a hospital that could have been prevented with, less than $30 of supplies and medicine. And it was really hard to get a hold of her medical provider, who, by the way, I've been in touch with since then. I have all the respect in the world for her medical provider, but the system made it difficult to get involved, like really engage with the medical provider. And I got really angry at the system. And I was like, I'm going to go fix this problem. And so I went and I applied to get a doctorate at USC. And I wanted to figure out exactly how to solve this problem. And it turns out we have the medicine, we have the devices, we have the understanding of psychology. We understand all these things, but the system hasn't allowed us to put it together. So I got really angry. This happened.
That's a beautiful form of anger.
Yeah.
Well, congrats, man. I think that's amazing. I knew people talked about curing type 2 diabetes. I mentioned it briefly in my book, but you're actually doing it.
I'll be pedantic. We're not curing it. We're reversing it. And I think there's...
What's the difference?
Well, curing it would mean that I could go and eat whatever the heck I wanted. It wouldn't come back. Like it didn't... Yeah, and so insulin resistance, which I'm sure you're aware of, is a real big problem. So I don't know how to, like, cure the problem with insulin resistance. I just know how to counteract it permanently and sustainably. And so, but that requires behavior change over a long period of time, like sustainable behavior change.
So if you treat me and it reverses it, I can't go back to drinking the 2-liter Mountain Dew, Code Red.
Yeah, I mean, you could. It just might take a lot of insulin, and then which is counterproductive because you're making insulin resistance a bigger problem. There's some virtuous cycles, and there's some not so virtuous cycles in all of that. And so we try to help patients understand all of that, kind of wherever they're coming from. So we try to meet them right where they are with their current knowledge base, their current ability to spend money and time. And, treatment burdens are really big problems. How do you reduce treatment burden, reduce cost, and improve clinical outcomes all at the same time? And how do you do that in a way that doesn't cause the provider to burn out?
That's a great origin story.
I think it's like, I just want to say to our listeners, go out and buy the book.
Yeah, for sure.
We have hit on a bunch of stuff, but I had multiple things written down that we could have talked about, and there's tons and tons of great stories in there. So go out, get the book, and thank you for you're helping this works. Tales of Abundance is the podcast, and you are helping bring abundance to the world by making the world healthier, making people aware, kind of taking the blindfold off people. So just thank you for the work, and I look forward to the next book.
And I want to thank you for shining a light on the difference between abundance and the illusion of abundance. That is my huge aha moment for today. Is that, I mean, you are helping people to see something so clearly that I wouldn't have put my finger on before our conversation today. And now I'm going to go talk about it. I'll give you credit, of course, but I mean, that was a real aha moment for me.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Thanks for being here. It's been fantastic.
All right, listeners, check out the show notes. We'll put some links in there for where you can find Matthew. And like Randy said, get the book. Like, this was a great, great read. I think it really helps anybody understand more about not just fiat and food and their own health, but it puts some real great stories behind it and help you think through, what's going into your body and who's influencing that. So thanks again. And check out talesofabundance.com. Thanks, listeners. Subscribe, like, listen. We want to hear you back next time.